As you can imagine, it's my pleasure to be here. So thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to Claire Champenois and to all the other organizers for this kind invitation and for the opportunity to come to know this community that was completely unknown to me so far before the. And yesterday, I think that I had a lot of insights from the presentation for being with you and so on. So what I'm going, I have 2 PowerPoints, very short, done on purpose, very short, so that we have more time for questions, not only at the end, but while I'm talking, if you want to ask me something more, to make comments, to bring your experience on, you are very welcome. You are not disturbing me, you know, I can go on, and would be more nice if we can talk together, especially because we are going to talk about methods. So you see, one thing that all the professionals loves to do is to ask to each other, how do you do? So to exchange this kind of small knowledge that is very, very important. So my aim is to try to do something similar. I was also resisting a little bit to the kind of question that I had, because the distinction between this morning, that was the title that I guess Orla and Claire gave to me, was a little bit like making a distinction in the morning, study design and data collection, and then in the afternoon analyzing, presenting. Oh, this for me is a little bit like the usual rhetorics, how you do or how you should do research. Actually, we all of us, we know that life is more messy, and this clear distinction do not hold. That's why I thought that in this morning, I will take the background and the personal experience, because I think that is very useful if you understand from where an author comes. It's more easy to understand the kind of argument that is doing and the way of looking that is taking. So that in the morning I'm focusing more on practice and, so to say, my take on practice-based studies, while in the and presenting, talking about a book. And in the afternoon, I will do similar things based on another book on more on entrepreneurship, entrepreneuring. Okay, so just this. To give you an idea what to expect from my 2 presentations. So let me see if it works like that. I know a little bit things more. You see, if you want to know more about, I am in the University of Trento. Maybe you know that. I'm retired, happily retired, so that now I have time to read and to write. Finally. And I am a sociologist, so I never work in a business school, and I can say that I'm a well-educated sociologist, in the meaning that during my studies, still at the university, I came across all the sociological theories of practice, so that Bourdieu, but first of all, I should say ethnomethodology, that not always is recognized as a practice theory, but I would say that even if the word practice is not used as it is used more recently, but for sure ethnomethodology is the beginning of practice. So that when I was still at school, meaning at the university, I was studying ethnomethodology, Giddens, Bourdieu, so that when I arrive to propose this that has been called the return to practice, in my hand luggage, there was already practice theory from a sociological perspective, so from a discipline, okay? And then our research unit that we founded it in 93 was around, you see, organizational learning, communication, organizational learning, and aesthetics. It's still there, so if you want to go to the website, you will see who is still there in Rucola. And I'm telling this because sometimes instead of saying I will just use we. And it's not because I have a big I that I become a we, but just because most of my work has been done with my friends, with my colleagues, with Rucola people, and I will give you a feeling of how we arrive at practice theory and what for. So to introduce my background in practice-based studies. In a sense, I was very lucky. I was very lucky because when we start publishing and when we went back to practice, and the first, my first writing was editing this special issue of organization, was 2000. So it was 1 year before Schatzky, Fonsavigny, and Norsetina published their book. So you see, at that time, I didn't have to worry too much about Schatzky and all these philosophers, so that my conversation with them came later on but in a sense, this is because when I think at the PhD students that start now a practice-based study, they have to deal with a huge amount of literature that came out in the last years. I think that there has been at least 7, 8 special issues on practice-based studies, and to find their own way through this literature is not so easy. So this is why I say I was lucky, because when we start, and our reason for looking at practice theories was that in around 93, 95, I was involved in a big European project that was coordinated by the VSB in Berlin. And so there were 20 research projects going on at the same time around the idea of organizational learning. A handbook came out from that. And I was working around, my research question was around if organization learns after an industrial accident or not. So my take, the way that I was looking at organizational learning was with this question in mind. I'm not an educationist, so my learning was clearly organizational learning at the level of the organization, not of the individual, and so on. So the reason for, and I'm going to present this research today to give you the idea of how we elaborated around the methodology, in which way, and with which concept. I will arrive later to present this. But in the meaning that while we were working in a network of people at that time, I'm talking with my big co-worker at that time was Davide Nicolini, when he was still in Trento before moving to Warwick. And that's why, together with Davide Nicolini and Dvora Janov in 98, we proposed a symposium at the American Academy of Management, inviting the other, so to say, the other people, the other groups of people that at the time were working with similar ideas around knowledge. So that there was the Dvoroyanov, I think that you remember her work on the flute makers. There was Frank Blackler for activity theory. David and me, we presented a paper coming from actor network theory. There was Etienne Wenger for communities of practice. Unfortunately, at that time, we were not in touch with people working on workplace studies, with Christian Heath and the group at the King College. But we organized that symposium, and from that symposium came out this special issue, where we were talking on learning and knowing in organization, and especially on theorizing. We put theorizing in the title, yes, what we say yesterday, practice-based theorizing. So that is, so to say, the beginning, my background, and the reason. And the reason here was that we were looking to a third way between Scilla and Charybdis. You remember the two big monsters. And these two big monsters were, on one side, a cognitive approach, and on the other side, the economics of knowledge, so the commodification of knowledge that at that time was becoming bigger and bigger in the community of knowledge management and so on. So for us, practice was a way of avoiding cognitive approach on one side, and also the idea that knowledge is like a package. You package the knowledge and then you can mail it and so on, transfer, so that our takes on knowledge was exactly that knowledge is embedded in practice, is embodied, first of all. That's why the A in Rucola, the aesthetics. So you know through the senses, as we saw yesterday with Karen and Malin, our body is a knowledgeable body, so we know the body, our knowledge is embodied. So practice was a figure in discourse, if we want to quote Roland Barthes, where knowledge is an activity. I think that this has been, from my group of people, has been the main contribution, to look at knowledge as knowing, and knowing as an activity, a collective activity. I will come back in a while, but this is how also to develop a practice lens around the idea of knowledge. So going back to my background, I would say in 2006 there was the book, and I want to stress, look at the title of the book, The Texture of Workplace Learning. And to the concept of texture, I will come later. Then I was editor of two special issues in 2009, one of management learning, the other of the learning organization. And here is, again, the reason for preparing the first, the critical power of the practice lens, was a dissatisfaction with the concept of practice, that we have the feeling that was taking more and more in a commonsensical understanding of practice, and what was at risk of being lost was the critical power of the practice lens, so that the idea of why to return, why to rediscover practice theories in the plural around the 2000 was because it was possible, so to say, to keep distance, again, other Scilla and other Gheradi, to take distance between the duality, structure versus action, and also habits versus action. So that practice has elements of structure, of action, has elements of habits, has elements of action, but cannot be conflated with either the one or the other. So that is why practice was an in-between element. Later on, just to finish with my background, for Edward Elgar, I prepare two books. One is How to Conduct Practice-Based Studies, and the second edition is coming out this year, I hope around June, July. And this book has a twin, so it was a twin books by Edward Elgars, because the second that I co-edited with Antonio Strati is a collection of empirical papers coming from Rucola groups, so that it is a twin. They came out at the same time. I like to think of them like my twins, because on the way that I wrote How to Conduct Practice-Based Studies is not a how-to-do book, even if it's meant to be ironic, the title. And it is a story, is a narrative around the practice of doing practice-based research. So it's not a how to do, but is to show how other people have done it that can inspire or not. I think that, well, I saw that in the readings for this seminar that there was that book, so maybe you have seen that I prepare it with boxes, so short stories about other people's research, so that one can be inspired, can be more similar to what they have in mind, or more different, but it's just like a palette of colors that you can pick up from here and there. So that is the background. If you want to ask me something more about the background, you are welcome. Then I go on. So my personal elaboration of practice theory. Maybe you know or you have read that article by Jorgen Sandberg and Ari Dimostrukas, what practice is, I can't remember the title exactly, but they make a distinction that I think is very useful, and if you want, we can discuss it further. They say in the literature, in the big literature already, there are three ways of understanding practice. The first is a commonsensical way, so that practice is used like in everyday language practice, and of course, this is not very useful, not for theorizing around practice, also because practice is a polysemic concept. Practice is a way of, if you practice violin, like girl says, or something, so there is an idea of learning. Practice, like educational people use it, is like medical practice. So it's so big that when you talk about medical practice, which practice, which doctor, and so on. And the other is an idea that of practice like, let's say, an institutionalized way of doing things. So more qualitative understanding of practice, like our practice of doing seminars here in Nantes, in Audencia, and so on. So there are a lot of problems already with the simple use. The commonsensical use of practice is not so common as we could expect. The second are the general theories of practice. Jorgen and Ari, when they talk about a general theory of practice, they have in mind Bourdieu, Giddens, or Chasky. The idea is like Parsons in the 50s to have a general theory so that you can explain any practice according to the general theory of practice. Okay, it's a choice. Personally, I think that the time for general theories of anything is past, because, I mean, a general theory is so abstract and so general that at the end, for methodological reason, is not very useful. Because to say that a practice, like we say in sociology, like Chasky says as well, a practice that is done of saying and doings. Okay, people talk and people do. So what? Sorry, just to give an idea that general theories. And the third way is to have domain-specific theory in the plural of practice. Mine has been developed around learning and knowing in organization, and others, you see nowadays, we see a lot of not only strategy as practice, marketing as practice, leadership as practice, entrepreneurship as practice, and so on. And I have to tell you that in the beginning I had mixed feelings. You know, I say, well, now it is a sort of fashion that everything is in this analogic way as practice. So I had mixed feeling, but now I think that it is there is something more. It's not a fashion. There is something more, because if you want to talk about a practice approach or a practice lens, so that the object leadership, the object strategy, the object marketing is formed within some epistemological practices. So this spreading of the turn to practice has a meaning, because it's bringing something new, as Niels will say, it's bringing something new in a lot of disciplines, having a theorization of this discipline that are more, if you want, more humble, that the general theory for explaining practice, but are more precise. What is entrepreneurship when you look at entrepreneurship in a situated way? So this is just a comment that came to my mind yesterday while I was listening to the different interpretation, that I was convinced that there are good reasons behind all looking as practice. This is not exactly my way of taking the theory of practice, because I'm interested more on studying practices and on contributing on theorizing practice, than not on theorizing learning and knowing, or if you want, both. A little story. David Whittington will be here tomorrow, and we have one presentation together in EGOS many years ago, but within EGOS there has been two standing working groups on practice theory. That was a little bit strange, but maybe you know more strategy as practice, maybe less learning and knowing in practice-based studies. But this is to say that we started almost at the same time, but with different knowledge interest, in the meaning that strategy as practice was mainly interested in understanding strategy and using practice if you want, an instrumental is not in bad terms, but a methodological, if you want, way for understanding strategy. I was instead more interested in developing a practice theorizing on working practices, for example, not on social practices more generally. Okay. So that my interest was for studying knowing, so knowledge as an activity, knowing in practice is the concept that I propose, and especially to understand practice not only as what people do, because I think that there are good theories for looking at work, looking at activities, but it's not what people do, but it's what people do together, so collectively, and knowledgeable, so that it's not that I do without, how can I do something without knowing or having an idea? So that practice is a collective, knowledgeable doing, even when apparently is a really individual practice. We were talking this morning, apparently we have our preferred example, and one of my preferred examples is brushing the teeth. What is more individual, but it's collective, because if you don't have an industry producing brushes, toothpaste, if you don't have the parents enforcing, have you brush your teeth before going to bed, and so on and so on. If we don't have a social idea about oral hygiene, we will not have brushing your teeth as a situated practice, you know? So this is just to see that it's not only the doing, but it's a knowledgeable doing, so that on this knowledgeable is what is in my heart. So where I come from, I develop my theorizing on practice coming from actor network theory and from feminist studies in science and technology studies that I put together, but I like to put it differently. The reason is that behind that there is a search for relational ontologies, relational epistemologies, relational onto-epistemologies that are joining other conversation with an interest in epistemological shift. Just to mention a couple, but new feminist materialism in the plural, post-qualitative studies, well, also CCO, constitutive, communication is constitutive of organization. I manage. Okay, so the point is to decenter the human subject as the seat of agency. That doesn't mean that we do not look at human beings or we take the human beings out of sight, but we give it another place. So in a practice, there are the humans, but agency is not a capacity only of humans. Materialities, tools, technologies, objects, artifacts, whatever you put there, discourses, rules, and whatever other elements of a practice. The point is that they are together, they are linked together, and a practice achieves agency because all these elements are linked, are in Gheradi word, are entangled. But entangled means that you cannot separate subject and object. It's not subject and object, and then they are entangled like intertwined or untwined. according to different ways of defining that. And this is why I like to use the post-humanist practice theory. And it makes a big difference in methodological terms. This is why I bring it here. I think that we have been educated in looking first at the actors, instrumental, meaningful action toward an aim, so that our usual qualitative studies, they start, we go to the actors, we interview the actors, we look at the actors, sometimes the actors are in a context, but this is the way that we have been trained to do like that, and we think and we repropose it. Well, practice theory is exactly for taking this away, to say that not only the actors, so not only the humans, the non-humans, but the more than humans, and in the more of humans there are not only animals, other companion species, but also the environment. So it's not that we humans have agency over the environment, this is, but that in a practice, the Mother Earth is there with us, with the consequences of our action and so on and so on. So you see, is the project, the post, you can put all the posts that you want together, is exactly that we take the human being away from the pedestal where it was before. And we have a more complex, more, so to say, more together with. Together with the world, in the world in which we live, not alone, not in charge of that, but in complex entanglement. So you see, this asks us for a different epistemology, a different way of doing research, or at least we put the question mark around how can we take into account all this complexity. And this is the good thing about practice, is the possibility to look at how one practice is dependent into other practices, is running from the one to the other. So my point is not humans and their practices, like in the humanist practice theory, but as an agencement, and I use on purpose the French word agencement, of humans, technologies, artifacts, and so on and so on. If you want to stop me, you are welcome. If not, I go on. You are keeping my time. Okay, thank you. So, practice can be studied. Oh, yes, please. Yes, this is a long story, but just to make a long story short, agencement has an origin in Deleuze and Guattari, and has been traduit. Sorry, as soon as I say a French word, I go back to French. Has been translated in English as assemblage. Assemblage, assembling, and so on. That is the final product. I'm not interested in the final product, but in the process of, this is why agencement has, you see, has back agency. So it's the process. And a practice epistemology is a process epistemology, because practice is practicing. And if you want, here is the lesson from ethnomethodology. Practice is an ongoing accomplishment. And it is a becoming epistemology and so on and so on. So it's not that things are or hold together, but is coming to hold together, that has more the idea that they can hold differently, but also can dissolve. And in fact, a practice is a practice as long as we practice it. I beg your pardon for all these practices, but in the meaning that if we stop doing seminar, the practice of seminaring disappear. So I think that to go back to agencement instead of assemblage has a meaning also because brings again practice as epistemology. I will go a little bit faster. So the point is that a practice theorization avoids us to think that the world is constructed in the mind, in discourses, in interaction, but rather in social practice. So it allows a shift from ontology to epistemology, so that instead of asking what a thing is, what is entrepreneurship, what is practice, we ask how is it constructed. So that allows me to go back to say that a practice-based approach is a methodology within a field of studies. So that a field of study can be work, urban planning, art, entrepreneurship. So it's a field of practice that delimits a thematic area within which to ask how is the object. The object can be work, urban planning, art, entrepreneurship. How is it accomplished? And I would say with not only how it is accomplished, but also with which consequences. That is the big opportunity around that. Okay, so said, I will talk, I just choose 4 concepts to look at a practice-based approach. Situatedness, knowing in practice, texture of practice, and agencement. I go back to situated. Situated has many meanings, but I would like to remind you that it comes from feminist theorizing. So that situatedness of knowing means, the mother is Donna Haraway and Marilyn Stratton, and they were writing back in '85, if I remember correctly, about avoiding the God trick. What is the God trick? Is the dream of the positivist science that we can have a look, of course, from up there, but looking to what happens, so representing an objective knowledge. So the point is that the God trick, God is without gender, without sex, without gender, is out there and is able to see whatever, and without being implied, nor engage with what is down there. So the situatedness of knowledge means very simply that we produce knowledge standing somewhere, and we are different embodied people with a different socio-historical stories and so on. So our knowledge is always a situated knowledge, and situated is the other meaning, situated in time and the place. So when I say that the first principle is the situated of our knowledge. I want to say a lot of things, but I cannot say a lot of things in the same time. So just take it, our epistemological practice construct the object that we are studying, and the objects are multiple objects. And I like to quote another mother, that is Anne-Marie Moll, and these other people in in Amsterdam and around that, where they also form a new word, a neologism, praxiography. So the praxiography is the use of ethnography for telling stories around practice. And in telling stories about practice, they show how the object, the practice, is differently done in different places. For example, for those who are not familiar with their work, what is anemia or what is another disease, they have illustrated how the so-called disease is a different object according to the medical world in which it is studied. Or John Law, what is a salmon? A salmon is a different things in the scientific object and so on. So just to mention quickly, then we can see, but especially we can see how this concept inform how we study. Practice as a collective knowledgeable doing means that we look at knowing in practice, and knowing in practice is how heterogeneous elements comes together, and how knowing in practice, our knowledgeable doing, is embodied, is a sensible knowledge, is aesthetic knowledge, and we know together with and with the limits of all the materials that we use, or the scientific apparatus, for example, that we use in order to produce knowledge. Yes. Very briefly, aesthetic knowledge is sensible knowledge, in the meaning that is knowledge that we have through the senses, through the eyes, through, well, all our 5 or 6 senses, and this something that we have. Yesterday we had, a little experience about using our feet to, to see how the smoothness of the floor where we were walking and so on. And this is a professional knowledge. I mean, all the profession has, having an eye for an article when we arrive to make a review. I don't know how you do, but usually I do like that. And I have already the smell if it's going to go through or not. Blah, 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 blah. Second passage is that on the knowledge through the senses, so knowing with the body, through the body, and with other bodies. That's why yesterday I picked Claire's arm, and I had her arm, her body together with my body in walking around. Okay? But there is also the aesthetic judgment. This is a seminar, doing this seminar in this way is not only because it is effective or more effective, but it's also because it's nicer. And we try to do things that are nicer. So there is an aesthetic judgment. I wrote a paper on taste making. So sustaining a practice, sustaining a situated practice is also going through a process where we, again, collectively elaborate a sense of this is a nice practice. This is the way that we like to do it in here, or the other way around, awful practice, So the aesthetics, the first part is the beginning of the aesthetics knowledge, that is knowing through the senses, with the aesthetic judgment. That is something that all practitioners do in a situated and collective way, elaborating a vocabulary for taste and for practice. A short story, thank you for the question. And okay, then I want to go to texture of practice, that is the idea of connection in action, and I will give you in the context of the book, okay, and together with the fourth principle, that is agencement. I said already something about that. We can go back, just I selected this, but we can go back. But I want to show you how and in which sense our research design can be inspired by this four concept. So I give you an example from my work. That is what I mentioned you in the beginning. So we were studying safety as a social practice. I go back to say, what is the meaning of safety as a social practice? So safety through a practice lens means that safety is a social competence, is an emergent process that is realized in situated practices, which is socially constructed, innovated, transmitted, sustained. If you are a little bit familiar with research on safety, you will see how this is a lens, okay? To say that practice is not in the instrument, is not in the norms, is not in the instruments, but is something that is emerging from a field of discourses, of ways of doing, of norms, of course, but is something that is social, historical, situated. The point is, well, if you have this in mind, how you construct the research design. I will show you. This was the research design, what has been named the spiral case study. I will go through in a moment. You can imagine something, a spotlight like that you put down there, you move up, but you can do also you can do it bottom up, top down, so are not levels of, but are more an agencement of practice, or what I called the texture of practices. While the idea of texture is not my concept, if you want, has a long, also philosophical story in connectivism, Pepper, and Emery and Trist were talking about the texture of organization and so on. Once again, texture has brought forward not only an article that is forthcoming in some high-ranking sociological review, is for a textural sociology. So the idea of texture has an advantage from my point of view, because it has a dual meaning. Texture are the warp and weft. Yes, I always forget this word, weft and warp. So like a textile, but you know, the textile can be touch what you have on you. Different feeling. So a texture is the texture of my jacket, of your jacket, and so on. So it's theft and warps are there. So there are a principle of ordering. But also there is a qualitative elements. And if you want texture, you see, have the word text discourses in it. So it's a way of acknowledging the waving of something, but also how the final product of this waving of knowledge, in my case, has different qualitative qualities. Okay? And why I prefer texture? I give you a rough idea of different ways. You see, 10 days ago I was in Torino for a conference on urban studies and the practice turn, and that image was what they choose for talking about the bundles of practice. I discussed it several times with Ted Shasky. Very nice, the bundle. Davide and me, we have the idea, being Italian, of the spaghetti is a good image of a bundle. And of course, you can take one spaghetti and then try to follow it. But the difference between a bundle of practices, you see as an image, and the texture of practice, that is the spider, and it is a methodological choice, is that if you have in mind a texture, you can follow the practice in linking how the same practice take an hospital, they take whatever disease you like, and follow how one unit is linked to the other unit, and so on. Not in a plenum of practices, because at some point the texture of practice finish or becomes more loose. But with the texture, you have the idea that you can follow as it goes. With the bundle, I think that is more difficult, just to take a thread and follow in this way. Or, for example, I have a difference with Davide later on when he made the zooming in and the zooming up. Out, because the zooming in, okay, is another metaphor. You see, these are images, but our images works a lot in our mind. And so my image is like the spider. In doing research, I go and where one practice brings me to other practices. In zooming in and zooming out, I have the camera, you know? This and the macro photo and the big one. So I think that there is a jump between how small should be the small and how big should be the big. Up to you, okay. But these images works differently in your mind and in the way that you prepare your methodological choices. I go back to my spiral. Just to give you an idea, we have been working, this is more like a project, a program of research. We have been working for 6 years around that. And we started with knowledge is our point, knowledge, safety knowledge. So the first choice was, okay, we follow a practitioner, a novice le chef de chantier. Sorry, I go back. I begin to be tired. I don't have the English word, le chantier. Construction site. Sorry, thank you. Sorry. So how to become a manager in the construction site? So what I say we, but in this case, ethnography was the field work, and it was Davide Nicolini who made the ethnographic study for 3 months. He was following a novice in the construction site, saying that he was part of that school preparing for becoming a construction site manager, but he have missed a lot of school hours and so on. And the reason is quite easy. Can you imagine that I do I'm shadowing somebody in a construction site in Italy. I'm quite visible. Even Davide, who is 2,000, is quite visible, but being a woman would be a different visibility. Okay, so the beginning of the story is that we say, well, we start studying with ethnographic method how safety is taught to a novice. I don't tell you all the details, but that was, so to say, where we started in that moment, and was very nice because what we understood was not, well, in a construction site, people do not talk about safety. There is the silence of the organization. That is that you learn it by watching, and mainly it's your business to learn safe working practices. Okay? So that was, for us, was the first very important lesson that we had from this study. And we were looking at the novice. Then we were looking how, in a community of practitioners, keep in mind the construction site where there are a lot of occupation, profession working together, not only together, the one over the other. So how this knowledge of safety is done. And for example, this is the third study, we arrive in the field with a very simple question. We ask 3 different communities, the engineers, the site managers, and those in charge of the economics of accounting and the economics of the project. We just interview them with one question. Why accident happen? You may say that is silly. I mean, when my students go to the field, they want to have the interview, 150 questions. Okay. If it's safer for you as a student, go on. But most of the time it's simple just to have a question, because people then answer why accident happen and how to prevent accident. And we did a very, with small statistics, but we were looking at if these 3 occupations had a different explanation of why accident happened. And as you can imagine, the answer is yes. Just to give you, the engineers have the checklist mentality. If you do this, 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 and this, accident do not happen, and if they happen, is an error, is a mistake. That the site manager has like a Perro normal accident image. Accident happen, continue to happen, is normal that they happen because there are interdependence between blah, 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 blah. And for the accountants, the economic responsibility is just an accident is a cost. So the point is how to have an accountability of this cost and so on, the average cost of a work accident, how many work accidents per kilometers happen when you're building, blah, 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 blah. But it's also true that working on their accountability practice, you can reduce accident. This is what Stuart Clegg in Australia was doing. So apparently it's not another practice from the results. Okay, I have, as you can imagine, I have a lot of stories about that, and I avoid to do it because the point is how we do. So you have the image of the spotlight, first in the construction site, then different communities in the same construction site, talking across community. So this talking across community is also a way of socializing to the logic of practice of different communities, because they are interdependent, and the way that they do and understand the world is quite different. So they also socialize to each other logic of practice. Then we move to say what happened in an organization when a major accident take place. And we were conducting 5 case studies of places where either a death or a big accident has taken place. And that's fine, and then we say all that research was done in the same geographical area. So we say in a geographical area, that's why the texture of practice, there are the individual, okay, there are the individuals participating in an occupational community. We have different communities, communities inside one organization, but we have the industry, and we have other connected actors like tribunals, like a health officer, and these people is not disconnected or just institutionally connected. They are talking to each other, so that safety as a social practice is done in a texture of practices, and is done differently in the area where I was conducting the research, that is the north of Italy, with respect to the south, maybe with respect, but I saw that also in Europe, in other areas, safety is done differently according to the geographical area where it is done. So apart, what else? I hope that I gave you an idea. So the idea was this spiral case study, and it doesn't matter, you see, where you start. This is the important part. You can start whenever, and of course going down, so to say, or going up, or better, I mean, maybe that this graphic representation is not the best one, but just to understand that you can take one practice and then to follow the other practices that are interconnected. For example, in another study that we have done, we started from a change in the law, so that we started from a new law that arrived in Italy, restrictive of the possibilities for medical assisted reproduction. And we saw how from the new law, this new law went to change not only the practices in the medical assisted reproduction, but also the relationship between the gynecologist and the biologist, but also change the technology. One technology that was in vitro fertilization that was used as the normal way of doing it was a change to forgive the words, but we have a case of changing the technology that was coming not for more instrumental effective ways of doing the things, sometimes the other way around, but because a change in a law. So this is just to give you the idea of there is a need to define a practice that you want to start with, but it's not so to say, it's not so dramatic, meaning that you can move around to follow what interests you. So if you have in mind Latour and Vulgar, when they say follow the actors, that comes back from ethnomethodology, huge, follow the actors. Here you can say follow the practice, how one goes into another. So if you want, or if you ask me the contribution from this study to, as you can say that a safety culture is learned when joining a community of practice as a distinctive characteristic of professional identity. Safety is learned in conversation at the border between different communities. Safety is learned while mending the organizational texture, because an accident is a breakdown in the organizational texture. Safety is learned within an institutional field. And if you want, you see how you can follow the different manifestation. And then I stop here.